the context I see this booklet within. And each of these points could be their own 2-hour conversation. But we're just going to reference some pieces here and kind of naming the fact that there's crises within crises, exaggerating other crises. Some are newer, some are ongoing. And of course, we're in legacies of crises. So at least one thing that feels especially pertinent and in the work that I'm doing in the past few weeks is the role of social media and how it has opened up the window for what has been going on in the US, but also globally, which is the state-sanctioned violence and murder of Black people. And so this is a crisis that is painting the context for these conversations. And simultaneously, right, the response, the reaction, there's opportunity around these global uprisings. And part of that also is say their names. Kind of in many, many countries, people have been saying the names of the folks that have been murdered by the police. And so if you have a moment, if you can add some names into the chat. Read folks out. So we have George Floyd, Philando Castile, that's right, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, Louisville folks. That's right. Cool. Keep those running, keep those coming. And then that crisis is, of course, couched within the COVID-19 crisis. And at least in the States, we've definitely been seeing how, we don't have money to respond to equip our doctors and nurses with the equipment they need, but we have money for police and riot gear and different weaponry. So in that kind of crisis, we also are seeing organic, decentralized mutual aid organizing. That was a massive thing, kind of shifting people's thinking about like, how can we reorganize society? There's very creative options that are emerging right now. So that's an opportunity that's been circulating. Another ongoing crisis, of course, is climate, and you all have been in that conversation already with extractive economy practices and thinking. And then at the same time, there's been decades of climate justice leadership, more recently mass student strikes and Green and Red New Deal. And so that is an ongoing crisis. And then more recently, at least in the last 50 years, but also the last 10 years, the global political shift rightward. And we see that with Trump, Boris, Modi, Duterte, Bolsonaro, and then incited street violence. And then, right, the interesting opportunity around that is more conversation about everyday anti-fascism and everyday anti-racism, and getting that's becoming more creative and more palpable to folks that maybe were never in that conversation before. And then coming down to a legacy of crisis, right? Colonization, racialized capitalism, the stealing of land and labor and lives. And then also folks calling for CO2 elimination, reparations, felling of statues worldwide. And then of course, Murray Bookchin always has talked about dominance and hierarchy and systemic logic of supremacy and power over. And I am pretty compelled by and mobilized by the new leadership that has been on the scene, especially since the movement for Black Lives, where BIPOC, young, queer organizing demands are really shaping what is politically possible. So just naming different contexts and crises, I'm sure you all have been in this already, but that is important for me to situate this booklet. And I want to pull out two of those pieces, which is why the booklet, which is a growing, robust, vibrant student movement of declaring what a future could be, right? Mass student strikes. There with a ton of opportunity and making demands and making connections across contexts that has been pretty unprecedented. And at the same time, that's happening within a global shift to the right. And these two phenomenons are happening simultaneously. And then what I was seeing and what hearing folks talk about is the fact that people have also been calling for justice around the climate for decades and decades. And then what was happening is like these narratives happening simultaneously, but often a lot of space in between them, like calling for futures with climate protections, and then calling for what is it to have justice in terms of accounting for history and reorganizing society based on getting people access to what they need, and also the right kinds of technologies, and also adjusting and accounting for social relationships that got us here in this moment. And then the other piece is reactionary politics. Given the global rightward shift and the power grab that's happening right now, we are living in reactionary times and reactionary politics, and especially during COVID. And then what happens when that reaction shapes the political landscape. And so I was noticing also the difference and the tension between reacting automatically and then choosing a response, and choosing, knowing what the tensions are in our movements, knowing the challenges that we face, and then deciding which reactions, which choices we want to be in, so responding. And then also climate and COVID, in my imagination, are two crises that are begging us to ask the similar questions, which is, how should we reorganize? This shit isn't working right now. Many people, healthcare lives are not being taken care of, are not being kept safe. And these are very similar questions of what the movement for Black Lives is raising, is like, who's being taken care of, and why are folks not being taken care of? So what should we be reorganizing, and then toward what? So this little booklet is like a contribution in this direction. And yeah, 3 things every climate activist needs to know, in my opinion. One is that climate change is not an inherently progressive issue. If you're looking at the booklet, you can go to page 11 just to like check out more of what that means. At its core, I think folks in my generation, and definitely anybody who's younger, especially maybe in the student strike world of climate, we've only grown up in a political climate where climate is progressive, or it's within the realm of progressive, if not left. And so what this booklet kind of does is kind of name, like it hasn't always been, and it doesn't always have to be a progressive issue, and we actually have to fight to keep it a progressive issue, and we have to fight to keep it a left issue. So the booklet talks more about that. Number 2, how you think and talk about climate change may prop up racist right-wing positions. And I'll talk more about that in a moment, and we'll all like kind of chat together about that. And the third one is that the far right does not need to govern to influence. And I think what the booklet is trying to do is talk about the various kinds of right-wing formations, whether they are a party or a street formation, or even a charismatic leader. At different scales, there's different work that they do. And understanding that somebody doesn't have to have full control of governmental decision-making or moderate decision-making to be able to shift conversation or pull different narratives into discussion when they weren't there previously. And that can include anything from using, extreme doctrines of, well, they're so on the fringe of society, at least we're not like that on the inside, even if those ideas are traveling across different moderate, more far right, or even fascist spectrums. And let's see. Blair, can you put in the pad link? And so we're going to dive in a little bit more to the second point, which is how you think and talk about climate change may prop up racist right-wing positions. And here's 3 common pitfalls that I talk about in the book, and I would love to be in more conversation with you about. The first one is environmental protection. And in general, this is a political move that is really necessary to for climate policy, absolutely. And then there are ways in which it shifts or slips into either propping up racist narratives or attracting folks who are more interested in racist interpretations, or getting co-opted. So those are three things that we ought to be aware of in our progressive movements. So environmental protection becomes dangerous when a specific group of people becomes the target or the cause or the reason for pollution or the thing that we are trying to protect from. And, you know, a moderate interpretation of that might be, you know, pollution is happening because of outsiders, and more racist and even more fascist interpretations might be more about language around intruders or parasites, painting a people, painting especially people in motion, moving from one place to another as parasites, threatening a culture, threatening the environment, threatening civilization, or even like ideas of purity. So environmental protection has the ability to really move in that way if we don't anchor it in anti-racist frameworks. The next one is overpopulation. Haya Heller can talk wonderful things about, and very sharp, smart things. And this part of the book I really worked with Haya on. Basically, overpopulation blames humans and humanity for the climate crisis or for the environmental crisis. And what that does is it absolves onus, it absolves corporations and extractive logic from the equation. And then that can quickly turn racist when the emphasis shifts from overconsumption, like the issue is like, do we have enough resources? And instead of looking to wealthy countries for their overconsumption practices and the logic that allows certain countries and certain people to over-extract. And when you shift from that emphasis into narratives around procreation and habits of poor folks or poor countries, that's when overpopulation can really prop up some terrible shit. And just a side note, Blair put in the chat a pad with the question at the bottom. So if you want, go ahead and click that pad and then put in your examples into that while I'm talking. So how have you seen environment and climate being used to further? So if you have examples or ideas or places where this has happened, go ahead and type those in. And then I'll talk about this last point here, which is that corporations are the bad guy. And I want to be like really skillful here, is like, this is an anti-corporate, it came from the global justice movement, especially in the 90s and the 2000s. This is a very important analysis of understanding who has impact and influence, and that has been distorted in certain ways. And what happens is when it becomes very simplified, like an anti-corporate or an anti-elite argument, kind of sees that power as a shadowy conspiracy or a cabal, rather than that broad systemic logic. And what we know is propensity towards that, when you start to think of that, shadowy conspiracy, lens towards anti-Semitism in really insidious ways. So analysis, like how are we talking about it? How is it distinct from a shadowy conspiracy? Like that line of thinking. So if you haven't already, go ahead and click that pad. You all can like type in or read each other's examples used to further racism, further xenophobia, interpretations perhaps. Cool. And I'll just keep moving along. Just a couple of offers for you. I'm sure you're all aware of this anyways, but sometimes it's cool to see in a chart. I'm very chart oriented, excuse me. Right-wing interpretations of climate. So these three categories of denial, skepticism, and acceptance encompass a wide range of different right, far right, fascist interpretations. So know that There's a mix of categorization within these, but it's interesting to see different narratives in relationship to climate from these perspectives. So denialists can be anything from climate change doesn't exist anymore, or it's not made by humans, to it's too early to tell, or CO2 has positive impact on the environment. That's like the general bucket, a wide range within the bucket of denialism and rejection. Skepticism, there's many things that different far right and racist groups are skeptical about when it comes to climate, anything from the scientific evidence, trends, causes, impact, to more like the process and the bureaucracy and the action side of it. So yeah, political process behind mainstream climate science. Also the public and private responses to climate issues. And acceptance might look anything from economy and jobs should not be harmed. So really an emphasis on the economy and jobs, while acknowledging climate crisis is a real thing, and willingness to take action, but only certain kinds of action. To calls for, deliberating about global process or economic independence through energy, which can very much go into green nationalism. And then of course, like a really intense version is wanting to keep the social and environmental world pure. Like you can accept climate change within that line of thinking. One thing I want to point out is the report called Convenient Truths, Mapping Climate Agendas of Right-Wing Populist Parties in Europe. A research group based in Berlin called Adelphi did a massive survey of right-wing populist parties across Europe. They have tons of information. It's super interesting. Would highly recommend checking it out. This is just one piece about positions on climate science. So just take a look here of general denial, rejection, skepticism, acceptance, where different right-wing populist parties fall within those categories. You can take a read. Of course, this doesn't include more informal or grassroots formations, but these are just populist parties, right-wing populist parties. All right, y'all, we're gonna break out. My preference is groups of 3, if that's okay on the text side. And you will have 25 minutes. And my task for you is to do one of the studies together. They're anywhere from 2 to 3 pages, or you can find which one you want to choose. Hungary starts on page 39, Germany on 43, and so on. So when you are in your group, read one of those case studies together or discuss together. And the questions I have for you is, what is something new or interesting you're learning? Of course, it can be in this session, but it can also just be around this topic. And then how does this relate to your work? So just to share with each other, and then take a couple of notes, and we'll throw those in the chat too, so we can see what people were talking about. How is that, Blair, for text stuff? Is that possible?
Yeah, we can put people into those groups. Just to reiterate, the case studies are in the linked to your book?
Yeah, that's right.
Is that clear? So you want folks to check out some case studies, and you've got some questions here. And this will be visible, I think, in our breakout rooms. But just in case, maybe someone wants to take a quick screenshot, we can copy those questions and put them into the chat.
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, so here we go. We're gonna, and you said you wanted 20 or 25 minutes?
Let's do 25.
Okay. All right, 25 minutes. We'll meet back up and share what we discussed.
Sounds good.
Should be getting the invitation now. Yeah, I think Kate's right. I don't think the screen share makes it into the breakout room. So maybe if you could copy paste those questions into the chat box, that would be cool.
Hey, Blair, could you assign me? I just reconnected from my computer.
Yes.
Fuck.
Haha, can you hear me? Okay, no, very good. Take a few moments and type in the chat some of the interesting things or some of the things you all talked about and share them out with each other. Maybe one thing that you're taking away or an interesting point from the conversation.
So we just talked about the AfD, right? So I mean, I'm also in Berlin too, and yeah, I think it was just that how, I mean, in Germany, how like the environmental movement was not at all like based in progressive values whatsoever. So this blood and soil, like that's how it got its go. Yeah, and then just talked about the German auto scandal and the and like yeah, how the German Greens are also bourgeoisie and they also have some right-wing elements, and that the AfD is now, which is, so the AfD is like sort of like what, becoming the Nazi Party of Germany, how they yeah, they're kind of looking to mainstream, and by doing like, by also taking on some or environmental causes, but in an extremely racist manner.
Hear from a couple other folks, and then we'll also have a lot more time at the end for more discussion too. What was one takeaway or one interesting thing from your conversation? Mike says, we read about France, seem to have all found it interesting how the right can co-opt or absorb ecological catastrophe to further their own ethno-nationalism. That was a recurring theme in my research. I interviewed over 25 activists and academics in these different places. And mostly what folks were talking about is environment and climate is kind of like the icing on a racist cake. It's like the thing that gets used. It's not necessarily that they have ecological concerns. Sometimes there are ecological concerns. And those are core concerns, but very often it's the thing that's being used to further an agenda.
Yeah, I think we kind of got the idea that it was being used to sort of recruit into their thing, into their own movement.
Yeah.
My group looked at Poland, and we saw Poland as an interesting case studies, because in the words of one of our group members, you know, Poland was sort of in more recent histories in many ways duped by capitalists that left them very vulnerable to fascism. And we sort of also talked about how that creates one of the dynamics that we've been talking about on the far right, where just as feminism becomes sort of a colonialist intrusion, environmentalist sort of becomes this like colonialist contest, and you get this nation of Poland versus the, in the words of this group member, rootless cosmopolitan EU. So then we had a discussion kind of mimicking some of our conversations about dual power movements and the need for a working models of transition, but particularly in this instance where this country probably has a lot of high mistrust given their recent history.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Yeah. Maybe one more person. Thanks for your chat comment, Forrest. Giovanni said, we read the case study on Italy. One interesting point that we clarified in the discussion is the closeness of ecology nationalism link in far-right groups to the ecology populism link that is shown by the parties like M5S, which however don't have a clear ecological program. Also, we discussed the religious frame of ecofascism, which seems to be shared by Italy and the US. Totally. Cool, let's pause the discussion here, but like let that keep churning and we can come back to any of these pieces. There's just a couple more things I want to share and then we can just keep talking. So there's 3 parts to the booklet. The first one is kind of like talking about how it is that environment and climate can swing left and right. It's those 3 pieces around what every climate activist needs to know. And then it goes into the case studies in the center that you just read. And then the last section is for activists and organizers in political motion in a group to kind of digest some of these pieces together. And at the end of every section is like a study guide questionnaire that hopefully incites conversation in your groups, and you can have these conversations across contexts as well. So I'm just going to kind of go over the last conclusions part, which goes into lessons and strategies. These are the conclusions that I drew through conversations with the organizers and the academics from these contexts. Just the first one, which is underlying the whole conversation, is that climate transition is inevitable, but justice is not. And so having climate really rooted in the anti-racist justice framework is how we distinguish our politics from these slippages that we're talking about, or being co-opted or absorbed. And I kind of define that as intersectional, community-based, or community organizing multiple movements, mass movements. I also talk about ecology over borders for the politics of, you know, the veneer or the icing on top of the racist cake, for oversimplification. How the logic of ecology, the organic structure, the way in which that ecology actually can't operate in borders is a way in which I think that narratives can be challenged or confronted. Like in France, when they're talking about borders are the planet's natural ally, we can kind of complicate that and show how baseless and senseless that is when we actually look at the principles of ecology and interdependence. And then I kind of conclude with the fact that there are movements that are working on the same topic, obviously from a different perspective, from different histories, but that's all, in my perspective, kind of quite related, and movements that need each other. And again, this booklet is oriented towards maybe younger folks getting newly politicized around climate. If you are committed to climate, not only do you need anti-racism and a justice framework in your campaigns, in your actions, in your narratives, but you also need to work with movements that are anti-racist and anti-fascist, and there's skills, there's wisdom, there's ways of operating that we can collaborate and work together around. And that's actually one of my questions I have for you at the end, but I'll get there in a moment. So some questions I end the book with are, how do we bridge rural and urban divides? This tension, especially where there are right-wing populist narratives, and especially in the East, the tensions and the divisions get highly politicized and highly polarized. And so just kind of calling out the opportunity here of progressive movements, especially climate movements, if we are able to handle that well, how could we do that better? And the question of, do we abandon the narratives that have a tendency to show up in far right and racist campaigns and narratives? So around populism and anti-corporate. I know a lot of people are like, well, do we get to use, those are narratives that either came from the left or they sound similar, but they're being used in a different way. And the question I put out is like, do we abandon them? My argument is that we don't, but we get more refined and more skilled with them. And then considerations, which I really root this section with conversations with Peter Stadenmeyer. And the point is, what about alliances? Situational alliances or long-term alliances? And on page 72, I say, is it more dangerous to align with right-wing groups on climate issues and then run the risk of strengthening their repressive social agenda, such as border protection? Or does greater peril come from drawing a clear ethical line amidst impending ecological system collapse? Are temporary alliances less concerning for more localized environmental issues, or does forming any alliance set a threatening precedent? And so that's kind of a question or a consideration I conclude the booklet with, is like, we need to have this conversation before we need to have this conversation and figure out where our political lines are. So maybe some more conversation with you all, things I'm interested in hearing from you, or like, what do these lessons, questions, considerations look like in your context? How is your work bridging different divides? And then also, are there places in which you know that climate justice, anti-racist, anti-fascist movements are working together, or perhaps creating something that I haven't seen before? So just open it up here for discussion. You can pick up on anything I just offered or bring something else as well.
So if folks want to just drop an asterisk into the chat box, I'll keep stack.
Cool. Thank you.
I mean, maybe while we're waiting, Hilary, I can just ask you, obviously we're looking at all European case studies, but I'm curious what you think of this comparatively to the US, where it seems like, I saw at least one comment that someone was scared that when the US right starts actually taking this seriously, like what will that look like? Because it seems they're firmly, if we look at your categories above, in the denialist camp for the most part. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that as we segue into the next.
For sure. And what's interesting is the international connections of how much US think tanks are working with the denialist aspect that's reemerging in the UK, or also the ICA think tank in Germany. Like the places where there is denialism still circulating in Europe, which is not the common stance, the US is in that conversation in a variety of ways. And so, you know, that's interesting. I know that my climate justice activist organizer friends here are asking that same question of, okay, like when do they shift? It's, you know, the interpretation is like, they know it's fucking real, but they're not making that political choice right now. They're maintaining a denialist position for a reason. When that shifts to meet a demand or a goal that they're going to move towards, then they'll take up a different position. And I mean, I think that is how I would read or interpret what's happening in the US, is like when it becomes, maybe if there's another quote unquote natural disaster or some other kind of way that forces the conversation into acknowledging climate change in a more substantial way. My guess is that we haven't seen the shift yet in Germany, but we have seen it in the UK, where ultimately big business is what is being protected in that conversation. And the adjustments, the pivots that are made, I don't think it'll go from denial all the way to acceptance, or I don't know how it travels across the spectrum of that. But my guess is that the shift will ultimately be a concern that's mostly concerned about big business and fossil fuel industry and lobbyists in that kind of way. That would be my guess.
Thanks. Would you rather take questions one by one or group them together a few at a time?
Maybe group them, but also people can talk to each other. Like if there's a particular question to me, happy to go into it. And I highly encourage folks to like pose a question or talk to each other too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the past in our classes we usually use the hand sign for direct response, ampersand.
Okay.
So let's start then with Wild Heart and Jeff and Ryan.
Yeah, so just quick, I my work with Indigenous food sovereignty, the woman that I worked with was working, she assembled the working group on Indigenous food sovereignty across Canada, and she was working to dismantle like systemic racism and colonial ways of thinking within Food Serve Canada. And so what was needed was a lot of work of allies learning, like doing their own work to decolonize so they didn't perpetuate the colonial like patterns of thinking and behavior, and to center Indigenous women's voices who carried a lot of the knowledge of how to take care of the earth with bioregions and in a ceremonial way. And so that was, you know, a lot of climate change activists were involved with that, and like a whole network across Canada and the US. She was asked by the UN to go and speak about her work and the connection with the murdered and missing Indigenous women, because the treatment of Indigenous women, how that is not taken seriously with the Canadian government. It also reflects the treatment of how corporations treat the earth, like harming the earth and resource extraction, and also harming Indigenous women. So, thanks.
Thanks, Wildheart.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can take one from Jeff and Brian, then we can try to find some common threads. And
Cool.
Okay. Yeah, like I was just gonna mention the fact that in my experience where I am, I'm in interior British Columbia, like a lot of the people talking about ideas that would fall into kind of the eco-fascist category and whatever, it's not necessarily coming from a lot of people that would identify as conservative and whatever. They tend to be more climate deniers, but I find a surprising amount of liberals have kind of a lot of underlying ideas about, you know, tying environmental issues to poor people and rural populations and stuff, which is like, it's just something that I've observed, and it's maybe partially, you know, the like was said earlier, the North American situation's a little different. There's a lot more denial on the right-wing side. But it was just something I wanted to mention.
Yeah, just a quick response to that. Is that okay?
of course.
I think what is interesting about what you just said is, I mean, one thing I talk about in the book and what you just pointed out very plainly is how ideas can travel across different aspects of political life. And so ideas that are considered very extreme and far out there, and, you know, only sick people or mentally quote unquote ill people, or all these ways that get categorized as othering and pushing off these ideas to the fringes of society, just super misses the point in the fact that these ideas are in the center of society and are available in common discourse, but just in perhaps a different veneer or a different quality of touch to them. So I think what you raise is a really important point, and we need to get more skilled at talking about how these ideas pop up in multiple ways, and they might be part of quote unquote extreme actions, but those ideas are not necessarily extreme. They're quite common to the systems of belief that uphold our institutions, that uphold common sense. So thank you for that comment.
Brian, you want to jump in so far?
Sure. Hi. I just want to first say thanks for this discussion. It's a really important one for us to be having right now. And I mostly wanted to flag the continuing central role of the population discussion. When I teach mainstream college students at UVM who are environmental studies students, they tend to be pretty astute about a lot of things, but every year I'm astounded how many people say they're hearing a critique of the environmental focus on population for the first time in my class. That in their other classes, they're being told that population growth is an underlying cause of environmental problems. And of course, for decades, it's been one of, if not the major inroad for for right-wing thinking in the environmental movement in the US, and it continues to be extremely pervasive and extremely insidious. And I'm curious how you see that playing out in other places.
I know in Germany it gets used as a reason for border protection. I mean, that's kind of how it gets framed here in terms of like, in Africa, there are people and communities who can't control birth rates and, you know, are coming from war places, and we need to, as much as possible, keep that out of Europe. And so it gets quite nativist and border focused. And some pretty horrific things have been said by different AFD politicians. It's in the booklet, I forget the guy's name. But he talks about explicitly in terms of how population is one of the core concerns of what we need to do to maintain European society. And so it gets used around border conversations. It could quickly, and it does quickly, of course, show up in environmental and climate conversations. I think what you're pointing to is really important of like, it has like a reoccurring quality to it, and it shows up in lots of different kinds of movements. So I'm curious for you, Brian, like how have you seen it be challenged or confronted in useful ways?
Well, you know, in my classes, I give people various critiques of population discourse. Vandana Shiva and Maria Misa's article is one that I've used. There are a few others. They're, you know, in discussions of the commons, challenging the strategy of the tragedy of the commons myth. And there's been some recent good writing about Garrett Hardin's own hard right orientation throughout his history. But, you know, I feel like I need to be very deliberate and take it slow with people, because even for environmental studies students at, you know, who are in their second and third year at UVM, they've heard nothing but we have to address overpopulation, and even in their other classes, much less from their peers. So it's a very deliberate and careful process of trying to deconstruct what people have been hearing their whole lives.
Right. And I think in moments like COVID-19 and narratives around humans are the virus, at least some aspect of that, I think, is in that conversation. Like the givenness or the common sense piece that you're pointing to, of like they've been hearing it their whole lives. We were talking about that in our breakout group of how that narrative like props up so many other pieces, and I think rests on this idea of overpopulation and population narratives. Thanks, Brian.
So we've got Lemmy, Max, me, and Kate.
I'll go next. I'll just take like half a minute maybe. I'd like to make sort of a statement and a question, like a fusion of an aspect that I feel has not been discussed in certain detail. So like one of the highlights, or like the core feature of like neoliberal capitalism over the past 30-40 years has been like focusing on ideological hegemony. You know, like there is no alternative, instead of like making capitalism like an actually viable alternative. And like central to this is like shattering people's imagination, absolute total war on the imagination, and all other alternatives. So like here we are, like with an overwhelming majority of people knowing that the system doesn't work, but at the same time unable to think of an alternative. So like in this whole scenario, in come the eco-fascists and say that, okay, look, hey, this is like a nice, viable long-term alternative to an extremely broken system that has shattered people's imagination. And that has like a huge appeal, which we haven't like discussed, I feel.
I just want to point to something quickly on that. I think it's really important to know that, and this comes out of conversations with Bernhard Faulkner, who is an academic in the UK, but his whole work focuses on this. He's really accessible and a lovely person, and I would recommend reaching out to him. I think one point that he stresses is it's not, and there's two distinctions here of like, ecofascism comes up a lot because there's been very particular, very fucked up expressions of it more recently. El Paso and Oslo and Christchurch, of course. I think it's important to point to the fact that this this position and this politic is not super prevalent. And that's not to say it's not threatening, but I want to like right size, like it's very easy to talk a lot about ecofascism, but that is one point within this like web and sea of context in terms of like how right and fascist and far right groups and even more radical or even conservative right kind of are dealing within this whole interpretation of climate and the environment. So I kind of want to like right size ecofascism. It's really like Naomi Klein is all talking about it now and all these things, and it's not necessarily that that is highly popular in the way that the media portrays it, but what we can point to and what is concerning is that the threads within ecofascism, aspects of those are within mainstream discourse. So that just came to me while you were talking of like, yes, ecofascism is speaking to something, it's mobilizing people. You know, the fact that it can be compelling in these kinds of ways, that's highly concerning. I absolutely agree with you. And, you know, we need to be adjusting and adapting to that facet and that feature. And I also just want to right size like ecofascism, its role within larger other right terrain, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for your response. Like this is like one of the aspects me, Mike, and Kelly were discussing in our breakout group. Like
Cool.
how prevalent is it actually? Like because like imagining like a size is like difficult, I guess. But yeah, thanks for it.
I mean, there's many things I don't know, and the things I do know are that there are, you know, if the politic is public and out, there's only a handful of groups pushing and peddling that shit. And at the same time, what we know, which is highly even more dangerous, perhaps, you know, in No Fascist USA, the book that came out with City Lights in March of 2020, the book I co-authored with James Tracy, we talk a lot about popular mobilization and confrontation and anti-fascist militancy and doing that in broad ways. And what happens when, you know, single people go out with guns and do a mass shooting. It's hard to organize broad coalitions against something like that, leaderless aspect to it. And that's a new feature within the last few decades or so, or particularly in the 80s, since the 80s. So I want to say that as far as I know, there's only a handful of examples of eco-fascist terror. That doesn't necessarily mean that the idea is not larger or moving in different kinds of ways, but I think if we all get a lot more nuanced around that, I think that our movements will be better positioned to be able to respond. It's a good question though.
So why don't we bump Kate up the stack? They had a direct response, and then Max, and then me.
Nice.
Hi. Yeah, I guess I am having trouble following everything because I'm trying to listen, but I'm also seeing this stuff on the chat. But
Oh, sure.
yeah, I guess I would consider myself among the naive people about this matter, and just I also apologize I wasn't here yesterday at all if this got talked about more, but just to clarify, are you saying that like we should just abandon the whole notion that we should have fewer children? Or are you saying, I mean, because it seems to me like we probably should have fewer children. Or are you saying we should abandon any discourse about it, and just because it's too easy to be co-opted by the right? Or are you saying that in fact, according to your analysis, it doesn't matter how many children people have as far as the future of the planet goes? Because I'm sort of, I guess I do take it as intuitive and common sense, and maybe you're saying that's just naive on my part, that people should have fewer children.
Should I answer? Should I? Yeah, I think a lot of people have written on this topic. I can definitely open it up and other folks can chime in. I'm not pretending I have the answer, and I definitely don't want to convey like you are naive or anything like that. And so I think it's a great question to be in. I mean, since we've already talked about the fact that how we manage and govern food systems and sustainability, that's really, really political, and it's less about resources in that kind of way. And what I referenced earlier is that when we emphasize procreation and habits, especially of poor folks, and we don't look at overconsumption patterns, especially of empires that have extracted resources, land, and lives from particular areas, then that gets really distorted, and the conversation gets very confusing and racist at the same time. If you're gonna have a kid, fucking make them with their dignity intact, like make them the most like radical, awesome little grenade that you chuck as far as you can into the future and hope that they go off and create a better world. So I'm not of the person, I'm definitely not that kind who's like, don't have kids, whatever. But it's a really political conversation, and I see some links being offered in the chat below, but I kind of will open it up to other folks too. What do you think? How can we deepen our learning here on this question?
No, but I guess I'm just saying, like, is this really sort of what, I mean, also I'm new to ISE, to social ecology, so is that kind of just like the accepted thing here in social ecology, that we should just, that people should just stop talking about about like having fewer children? Or am I just not on board and I need to just read some stuff? Or is there any debate about this, or within social ecology, or
First and foremost, I just want to say thank you and welcome to Social Ecology and Conversations. And these are great questions, so welcome. You get to be here. We want you here. And then I'll open it up to the old heads that have been in this conversation for a good long time.
Well,
I mean that with respect.
As an old head, I'll take that with respect. But I do think that it's not that we can't talk about population and even recognize that there is validity to the issue. The point is that the way that narrative has unfolded is that it really blames the victim. And we know when we look at demographic trends, we know that, for example, in the US and in Europe and in more affluent nations right now, actually, if it weren't for immigration, there would be less than, we wouldn't even be reproducing the existing population. So the emphasis is really placed on, oh, these poor people in Africa who keep having babies, and in India and in the developing world, and that's what's destroying the environment, and that's what's creating resource shortages. When in fact, if we address the kinds of inequities that exist today, if we were able to in fact distribute the food that's already produced in a more equitable way, we wouldn't see starvation, we wouldn't see extreme poverty, and the likelihood is, the overwhelming likelihood is, we would see population rates declining, because people wouldn't feel the need to have so many kids to ensure some degree of not even security, but a chance of survival in their old age. Plus the infant mortality rates are so high in many of these countries that in order to have any kid survive, you have to have a bunch of them. So it's all embedded within this larger context, I think. But I don't believe anyone is saying that there is not an important discussion to be had around population, but it has to be framed in a very different context.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm aware of all of that, but I guess I think that the idea that, for example, Americans should have fewer kids is is worth pursuing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is worth pursuing, but I don't think that we can create, that we can blame the ecological crisis purely on overpopulation, and that we have to understand that the fact that birth rates are so high and we are producing increases in population at an almost exponential rate has more to do with poverty and the maldistribution of resources than it has to do with some kind of innate human drive to reproduce and to populate the planet and overpopulate the planet. We have to look at who's being blamed in this process and where the blame really lies, if there is blame to be had.
Right.
Something I would add is, you know, there's a tendency in this culture in the US to personalize issues, and personal choices are important, but I think it's more useful and more promising politically if we can take a step back and encourage a focus on the more systemic issues. Let's look at consumption, let's look at production, let's look at how choices are made about what people consume, how much people consume, and how much is produced. And if we're going to point the finger in terms of the sources of environmental problems, that it's just a more useful conversation to look at it more systemically. And then we make our personal ethical choices with all of that in mind, but I think it's important to get past this tendency for the politics of personal choice to supersede the bigger picture conversations that we need to have. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yeah.
it makes sense.
To be honest though, I'm not so sure about like this education thing. Like, as if you're an educated woman, you then no longer can have kids. I think that's a bit weird. I honestly, I also think like population, like from the charts I saw, I thought we were gonna like top out at like 9 billion or something, and it would probably reduce. But I feel like it's a very strange conversation right now, to be honest.
Always. It's always a strange conversation.
But it makes sense too, because this is, I mean, I think as Hilary mentioned, as our earlier talks have mentioned, and I think, you know, Kate's comment highlights, does that mean we can't talk about population? Well, I think obviously it doesn't mean we can't talk about it, but it does, we do have to look at who is talking about it and the way they've talked about it very consistently. And that's the reason why social ecology has very consistently argued against emphasis on population, because it has so consistently gone in right-wing, reactionary, racist directions. And I mean, to me, this gets at the point I wanted to make earlier. I think it was Jeff's comment about liberal tendencies towards eco-fascism, or why liberals and how liberals might be open to that. And one reason for this is because they consistently present qualitative problems as quantitative ones. We've had at least 50 years of the ideology of growth liberalism in the United States, that we just need more and more and more, rather than a restructuring of how things are created and distributed. So the inverse of that, when you reach a problem point, is to then have less, 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 right? So in either case, you don't have to actually address the structure of that society. And of course, this ends up internalizing the kind of capitalist, social Darwinist assumptions that, you know, we're all in this struggle for resources and competition. So the best we can do is cut down on those numbers, that it's a numbers game. And I think that just gets it completely wrong. It's not a numbers game. It's a qualitative rather than a quantitative issue, and the qualitative ones create those. And it goes hand in glove with like problematic focus on overconsumption as a personal thing rather than structural things. And Bookchin wrote really good stuff on both population and technology as kind of false answers, because if you look at, you know, even the deforestation of the East Coast, you know, happened with hand tools, and it happened with very low population densities. And if you look at the United States as a whole, we still have relatively very low population density. And as Brian already mentioned, it's, you know, it's still going down if it weren't for immigration. So to me, I don't really see any positive emphasis politically in focusing on this, because I just think it already gets us thinking in ways, you know, that naturalize the way things are and pointing us in the wrong direction.
I think one thing I want to add, and one thing that came up in our small group conversation, was just the propensity for these kinds of narratives to come up and to really draw us into kind of directions that either really quickly slip racist and xenophobic, or kind of don't lead to structural changes. And I think one remedy for that, which is kind of the underlying point of this whole booklet, is how do we really base this in campaigns and organizing work, and work that pushes and challenges, and especially uplifting the demands of folks on the front lines. I feel like when people are in action, when people are organizing, talking, having conversations with people who are not like themselves, you know, you're gonna come across conversations and people and movements where then these narratives like just don't fit, right? Like you're not gonna buy into the humans are the virus and the COVID-19 is saving the planet if you know decades of, you know, the climate justice movement and what it's calling for in terms of like a just transition and ecological economy, and like what the vision is being, what visions are being put out there. Then these kinds of distractions, I think, will just be far less interesting if we have like a brighter sense of what else could be possible through organizing, through movements, through movement building. So I kind of situate that of like, if you have strong connections to movements for justice, some of these other narratives will fall away as like just not as relevant.
So Max, I think, was next on Stack some time ago, and
yeah, I'll hop in to completely change the direction of the conversation. Or maybe not, in fact. I just want to point to something that has been bugging me since I started reading about it. I encountered this piece about a year ago through a friend by a radical journalist named Cory Morningstar on the manufacturing of Greta Thunberg. I'm definitely curious to hear if anybody else in this particular area has read it. But broadly, I think that there is, you know, this risk of far-right ecologies are definitely is definitely at play. But speaking of this kind of world that we've mentioned, in which we can't imagine an alternative to capitalism, even the like more progressive-looking like ecological movement, and specifically some forces that are involved in backing advertising and distributing the popularity of the Fridays for the Future movement, is interested not in a critique of, for instance, like overproduction, but in a shift in the terms of production that allow them to like keep overproducing but create new green industries and make a new sector of capitalists extremely wealthy. So yeah, exactly, wrong kind of green. I'm going to post the exact link to the rest of it there. It's very long, but I think this is, I don't want to necessarily like make this the focus of the discussion, but I think it's extremely important to keep in our, like, in the ways that we are engaging with the movement, to keep a critique of production and the attack on the standards of workers, and the attack on and the like exploitation of and privatization of natural resources in developing markets. All of these kind of forces are super duper central, and there are plenty of people who would love to keep that part under the rug, and allow the movement to just funnel into carbon capture and things like that. Yeah, I'll leave it there again because this piece is extremely long and I cannot possibly get into all of it, but it's very well sourced, even if it sounds like a conspiracy theory.
Thanks.
We already said no conspiracy theories, not allowed.
Yeah, the good news is I really don't think it is. But it's kind of wild to hear some of the people behind it, including like Al Gore. Yeah, I have to admit that this piece has made me distrust Naomi Klein for her affiliations with some of these folks. But that's partly on me.
So I think we're through the stack at present. So we've got about 15 minutes left. So the floor is open, and Hilary said, you know, she'd like to see also some more horizontal conversation. I think we've been doing a little bit of that, but.
I just want to say something brief about the source that Max just mentioned. I've followed Cory Morningstar's stuff since she started writing, and I think she started out with some really positive motives to try to deconstruct some disturbing tendencies and various co-optations in the environmental movement. And from where I sit, her work has veered completely into the realm of conspiracy theory, and I no longer give her stuff a lot of credence, unfortunately. I think she means well, but has really joined the conspiracy theorist wing of.
Which is, of course, another, you know, big theme, bringing the ecological theme to COVID theme, especially in Germany. I mean, the COVID demonstrations there have been led by conspiracists who are highly anti-Semitic and et cetera, et cetera. And those have, you know, taken on new life and currency too. I mean, I see them very mainstreamed about, you know, everyone's getting Soros money. Soros is behind this, and he's also paying all the BLM demonstrators as well. So it's very progressive.
I think, I guess to just respond to some of that, I definitely have felt the conspiracy theory undertones in the lying map of this, but I think there is some like important things to be drawn out of it, including the greater mass of climate policy being produced by a small group of think tanks, which I think that, you know, that's not that far from, this is the kind of thing that happens in the world all the time these days, as well as specifically the ways that corporate organizations will finance and use popular movements to their advantage, which, yeah, I think that there is precedent for all of that in the recent times. But in many ways, that's also not a new statement. So, yeah, still something. Okay, I think I'll leave it because I definitely wanted to hear something like what Brian had to say.
Yeah, I mean, some of us at the ISC have been writing about various co-optations of the environmental movement since the 1990s, since the early 90s, or even late 80s. And it's an important discussion. I wrote about it at length in a book that I came out with in 1997 called Earth for Sale. But it's just a matter of how you do it. And, you know, I think to address Michael's point, when conspiracy theory is overtly racist or anti-Semitic, it's obviously easy to dismiss, but there's sometimes a fine line where there's an inclination to blame individuals rather than institutions, to overemphasize the role of particularly influential individuals. Blair cited my article, which I recommend on the ISE blog, about the latest Michael Moore film, which is a classic example of that. Al Gore has been an extremely problematic character for many, many, many reasons, both when he was in office and out, but to blame all of the problems of the environmental movement on somebody like him, who isn't even that significant a figure in any of the current conversations, except maybe in his inner circle of people in the investment world, not particularly influential in any movement circles that I'm aware of. It's inherently problematic. It's kind of a Manichaean worldview that individuals manipulating politics behind the scenes are the reason things aren't evolving in a progressive direction. And even when it's not overtly racist, that kind of thinking is not conducive to the kind of politics that really moves us forward, or the kind of movement building that we need. I think Hilary would agree with that.
Yo, I was just curious, could we get back to the team? Like, one thing I'm interested in, Hilary, I actually didn't want to jump on Stack to talk about kids because I didn't think we were going to be talking about that. I was interested, you said John Brown, something, you had a book about John Brown. And I was just wondering about like anti-racist act, like organizing, your thoughts on that.
All right. The book is called No Fascist USA, the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, which was an organization that began in 1977, and ended in 1993. And the book tracks the arc of that organization and then draws out lessons for today's movements. So it talks about like the history of militant anti-fascism in the US, and then how that formed in response to Black freedom and Black liberation movements, and how we can't have anti-fascist action without a lot of that being informed by, so this organization was an experiment in actually building and organizing around the principle of folks fighting for self-determination, and having confrontations with the Klan being a response to fascism and racism in the States. So it's a history book, and it draws out specific lessons at the end. And then, the conversation about who John Brown was and is, and how his legacy lives in movements, is a whole other discussion. But that book is, actually it's free right now, which is amazing and interesting as an author, but City Lights is making it available free to download as an ebook, given the political moment that we're in. So check that out if you want. There's like, I think 10 other books that they are offering for free this month in response to George Floyd's murder, as well as the uprisings happening globally.
Okay, cool. Because so honestly, one of the things that I've been really thinking about is, like, I think the abolitionist movement, which I know it's been going still strong, but I honestly think that the pacifist thing has failed pretty heavily in the last 155 years. And the reason I would say that is there are more African Americans enslaved right now in the United States than ever were under slavery. Also, felony disenfranchisement is crazy. I think even the fact that we call them officers and not like overseers or slave catchers, honestly, in my opinion, I feel like we're kind of hitting a point where it's, I don't think it, like, these murders are not going to stop until these, like, I don't think just protesting against them is going to stop these murders. Like Breonna Taylor's killers, 3 of them, not even arrested yet. Those guys are going to kill again. Like, a fact, I think. And I think there kind of needs to be a little bit of a discussion about that again. Because, I mean, John Brown also at the time, I think, really, he was, I mean, advocating for the I don't know, if you murdered some slaves or you wanted to capture slaves, you were gonna die. And I think I don't know, the way it's headed, I think we might be back to that square again.
I mean, those are legitimate concerns, and I think definitely read the book. You'll learn more about what John Brown was up to and what his legacy has been used and how it's been used throughout time, which is a complicated thing. It's not all glitz and glamour by any means. I think what is important is that the reason that these uprisings are happening right now and the reason that they have caught fire and all of a sudden abolition is on the table in ways that otherwise it was not even a month ago is because of decades of organizing and the demands that are happening right now for good housing, healthcare, education, these basic fucking needs. They are demands that have been, been coming out of Black liberation movements for decades. So they're also not new. And I think, what you're pointing to is absolutely right. Since the founding of this country, it's been based on genocide of Native people and then enslavement of African folks, and it just has taken many different forms throughout history, of course. There's a really good, I even watched it the other night for the second time, documentary on Netflix called The 13th. Talks about that amendment and, maps slavery into Jim Crow, into redlining, into mass incarceration. So I think what you're pointing to is pretty well represented in and historicized in that documentary of like state-sanctioned violence has always been a part of
anti-Blackness
in the States and settler colonialism.
100%.
But what
So
I
actually,
think is really important to re-ground, what I want to point to is like, how do we, from whatever position we're in, whether you're a teacher, whether you're an organizer, whether you're a caregiver, whatever position you're in movements that are on the move right now. So I feel like the demands that are being put out right now are super fucking compelling. How do we bring more folks into relationship to those demands and those movements? So that's what I care about.
Thanks, Hilary. I think that was useful clarification. Horse had a comment.
Morning, everyone. Just an hour ago, and just as a disclaimer, I'm the father of 2 awesome kick-ass Indigenous kids who are going to be anti-fascist freedom fighters when they grow up. But I'm just briefly picking up in your comment around the shootings happening, and obviously we had the shooting in Christchurch last year here in New Zealand, killing 49 people, injuring 51. And I think that the fact that the shooter identifies with ecofascism wasn't discussed a lot in the media here, and particularly now that he's chosen not to go to trial, I think not a lot of that of his thinking will come out. However, I think it's important to note that the government here, the Prime Minister, who's a very good communicator, was very quick to say, "This is not us." That became kind of the slogan and the official response. This is not us. This is an Australian guy who came here a year or 2 ago. This is some random dude who is not us. That was sort of the slogan. And the Indigenous movement here was quick, though, to point out that, in fact, this is exactly us. This is exactly what this country is based on. You referred to it as well, Hilary. New Zealand is based on 200 years of white people shooting people of color. That's exactly what this country is based on. This is exactly us. So I think, it's interesting how those in power also try to distance themselves from those actions. But while perpetuating that violence, as that systematic violence on a daily basis, with, you know, incarceration rates of Indigenous women in New Zealand, it's 60%. And meanwhile, they are only 15% of the population. So that violence continues every day. So just thank you for opening those conversations. Morning, everyone.
Thank you for giving us a on-the-ground perspective of that. And I'll just reference too, that happened in Germany in Hanau earlier in the year with the mass shooter. I mean, he didn't identify as an eco-fascist, but a lot of those ideas were kind of bustling around, including the Islamicization of the West and kind of like men's rights movement aspects. There was a whole bunch of different threads in there. And what the German government did for the first time actually was name it as a racist attack, which it hasn't done for many other things. And while that's fantastic for the German chancellor to finally articulate racism in Germany, at the same time, what they did was kind of distance him from society. He was this, he was mentally ill, he shouldn't have access to guns, and it goes into gun control. And what that does is exactly what you're talking about, right? It obscures the problem, and it obscures like the way that it continues and it perpetuates. One last slide. I just want to share some announcements, if that's cool. This Friday, my organization, Showing Up for Racial Justice, we are having a call at 8 o'clock Central Eastern Time, June 26th, just basically connecting folks who are taking action in support for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives, whatever that looks like in your context. We're just trying to connect with more folks around that. There's the link here, and I can send some follow-up stuff later. Just so you know, Burning Earth, Changing Europe is free to download. The link has already been in the chat a number of times. The German translation will be out in July, and you can order a hard copy for free sometime this summer. So keep an ear out for that, or you can even go onto that same link and put in your information and order it, and then it'll be sent to you when they're ready. They're being printed right now as businesses are starting back up. And then if you just want to be in touch or want to read more about Hanau or more about anti-racist struggles in Germany and connections to the US, you can go to my website, hilaryamore.com.
So much, Hilary. I think it was a really rich conversation and input. It's great. Thanks for joining us. For fantastic questions and really wide-ranging. We have recorded this. Unfortunately, it started a tiny bit late, but we got most of it. So we'll be posting that online the next few days. And our next session will take in 2 hours with Silvia Federici speaking about feminism and ecological struggles and the intersections between those. So please come back, and it's going to be fantastic. And yeah, thanks everyone so much, especially you, Hilary.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, ISE, for keep going. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Hilary.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, Brian.
Thank you, Hilary.
Hi, Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. Thanks, everybody.
So that's 6 p.m. Eastern for the next one.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Grace.
Hi. Sorry I couldn't be more present, but it was interesting.
Oh.